The sound of glassware and polite laughter filled the ballroom when my husband reached across the table and gripped my wrist hard enough to make the silver bracelet bite into my skin. "Not there," he said quietly, but the microphone clipped to his jacket caught every word and carried it through the room. 150 guests went silent. I had just set the last tray of food down at the head table. Candles glowed along the long linen runner. The Drake Hotel ballroom shimmered with gold light and crystal chandeliers. Partners, investors, neighbors, and members of our church sat dressed in their best suits and evening dresses, and my husband Thomas Collins was smiling at them like a man who owned the room. He leaned closer so only I could hear the rest. "Servants don't sit with guests." The words were soft, but the microphone caught them again. A few people near the front table froze mid-bite. Someone coughed. One of Thomas's investors shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Then a woman's voice broke the silence. "Oh." Olivia Grant stood beside Thomas's chair holding a champagne flute. She was younger than most of the people in the room, elegant in a fitted black dress that looked too expensive for a casual business colleague. Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second. Then she slid gracefully into the chair I had just pulled out for myself. Across the room, Laura Simmons, my closest friend, pressed her lips together so tightly the color drained from them. Someone near the back muttered, "Did he really just say that?" The room had the strange stillness that comes when 150 people suddenly realize they've just witnessed something they shouldn't have. Thomas laughed lightly, lifting his glass. "Now," he said, raising his voice for the room, "let's start the evening properly." Polite applause followed. Glasses clinked, but the air had shifted, because everyone in that ballroom understood exactly what had just happened. My husband had introduced his mistress to 150 people, and he had just called me the help. For a moment, no one moved. Then I did something that made several guests exchange confused glances. I smiled, not the tight, polite smile women learn to wear at charity dinners. A quiet one. Calm. Across the table, Laura frowned slightly like she was trying to understand what I was doing. Thomas noticed it too. For a brief second, something flickered behind his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned away from me and leaned toward Olivia, whispering something that made her laugh. A waiter stepped beside me, unsure whether to clear the empty serving tray from my hands. I handed it to him and stepped away from the table. The room slowly returned to its gentle buzz of conversation, though the whispers traveled like thin currents through the crowd. "She's just standing there. Is she going to say something?" "Did you hear what he said?" I walked calmly toward the gift table near the edge of the ballroom. Wrapped boxes and envelopes covered it, but there was one item that didn't belong with the others: a black leather briefcase. Thomas never let it out of his sight. He carried it to meetings, to church, even to family dinners, and tonight he had placed it on the table beside the birthday gifts like it was just another accessory to his celebration. My fingers rested lightly against the smooth leather. Across the room, Thomas raised his glass again, already telling one of his business partners a story that made the table laugh. He hadn't noticed where I was standing. He hadn't noticed what I was looking at. Laura had. She followed my gaze to the briefcase, then back to my face. Her expression shifted from confusion to something else, something closer to alarm. Because my smile hadn't disappeared, it had grown slightly wider. The truth was, by the time my husband decided to humiliate me in front of 150 people, I already knew everything: the affair, the apartment, the transfers, and the plan he believed would leave me with nothing. That briefcase contained every piece of it. But none of the people in that ballroom knew that yet. Not Olivia, not the investors at the table, not even Thomas Collins, and certainly not the 150 witnesses who had just watched my husband call me a servant. They thought they had seen the worst moment of my marriage. They thought the evening had already reached its most uncomfortable point. What they didn't understand was that the night had only just begun. Because while everyone else in that ballroom believed this was Thomas Collins's birthday celebration, I was the only person in the room who knew how the night was actually going to end. For a long moment, I kept my hand resting on the briefcase. From across the ballroom, Thomas was still laughing, surrounded by men who had helped build his reputation over the last decade. Their voices rose and fell with the easy confidence of people who believed they were celebrating a successful man. In a way, they were right. Thomas Collins had built something impressive, but the truth was, he had never built it alone. When I met Thomas 26 years earlier, neither of us owned anything more impressive than a second-hand car and a shared apartment above a laundromat on the north side of Chicago. Back then, he wasn't the confident man standing at the center of a ballroom filled with investors. He was restless, ambitious, and constantly worried about money. Thomas had big plans bigger than our bank account ever seemed able to support. He talked about property markets and investment strategies long before he ever owned his first building. He spent evenings sketching ideas on napkins at the small diner where we used to eat dinner because it was the only place open after his late shifts. I used to sit across from him with a cup of coffee listening while he mapped out the future like it was something he could simply decide into existence. "What if I bought a small building first?" he once asked, sliding a paper across the table covered in numbers. "You mean, if we bought one," I corrected. He smiled at that, and we did. The first property was barely more than a worn 3-unit building in Lincoln Park with peeling paint and tenants who paid rent late. But Thomas spent every spare hour fixing pipes, repainting walls, negotiating leases. And I kept the books. I tracked every payment, every repair, every tax form. At night, I would sit at our kitchen table balancing numbers while Thomas called contractors or met with potential investors who wanted to see if he knew what he was doing. Slowly, the numbers started working in our favor. 1 property became 2, 2 became 3. By the time Thomas opened Collins Property Advisors, people in Chicago's real estate circles were beginning to recognize his name. What most of them never realized was how much of the foundation had been built quietly behind the scenes. While Thomas handled the meetings and negotiations, I handled the structure. Spreadsheets, lease agreements, insurance renewals, tenant disputes. For years, our lives followed a rhythm that felt almost predictable. Work during the day, dinner together at night, church on Sundays, small celebrations when another building was added to the portfolio. When Thomas turned 40, we hosted a dinner for 20 people in our backyard. It was nothing like the ballroom tonight, just friends, a barbecue grill, and folding tables covered in white cloth. That night, Thomas wrapped his arm around my shoulders and told everyone in the yard that none of it would have happened without me. "This woman," he said proudly, raising a glass, "is the reason any of this exists." At the time, I believed him. The change didn't happen overnight. It rarely does. Success has a way of arriving quietly at first: a new client, a larger deal, better restaurants, more expensive suits. At some point, Thomas began spending more evenings at the office, then more weekends. At first, it seemed normal. Real estate deals often required long hours, especially as his company expanded. But something subtle began to shift. It started with small things. Thomas began taking phone calls outside. He started locking his office door when he worked from home, and he developed a habit I had never seen before. He carried that briefcase everywhere. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a new work accessory. Many business owners preferred to keep important documents with them rather than leave them in the office. But Thomas treated the case differently. He never left it unattended. When we drove somewhere together, it stayed on his lap. When we visited friends, it sat beside his chair. Even at church, he sometimes placed it at his feet during service like he didn't trust the building itself to protect it. One evening about a year before the birthday party, I walked into Thomas's office at home to ask him something about dinner. He was sitting behind his desk with the briefcase open. For a split second, I saw stacks of documents inside. The moment he noticed me standing in the doorway, he closed it. Too quickly. "Just work stuff," he said with a quick smile. I nodded and left the room. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. But the next morning, when Thomas left early for a meeting, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. The briefcase was gone. And for the first time in 26 years of marriage, I realized there was something in my husband's life that he was determined to keep entirely out of mine. That was the moment the briefcase stopped looking like a piece of luggage and started looking like a secret I hadn't yet discovered. At first, I tried to convince myself the briefcase meant nothing. After 26 years of marriage, suspicion felt like an insult to everything we had built together. Thomas had always worked long hours. Real estate deals came with secrecy negotiations, paperwork that wasn't meant for anyone outside the business. That was the explanation I repeated to myself. For a while, it worked. Until the other changes began. They were small enough to ignore individually, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to overlook. Thomas started coming home later. Not dramatically later at first, just an extra hour, sometimes two. When I asked about it, he always had a simple explanation. Client meeting, dinner with investors, paperwork that had to be finished before morning. His voice stayed calm, even warm the way it had always been. If anything, he seemed slightly amused that I would ask. "You know how this business works, Margaret?" he would say. And I did. At least, I thought I did. Then the phone calls began. Thomas had never been secretive about his phone before. For years it had sat openly on the kitchen counter while we ate dinner or watched television. Now it traveled everywhere with him. If it rang, he stepped into another room. If a message appeared, he turned the screen away before reading it. Once while we were sitting together on the couch, the phone buzzed beside him. He glanced down at the screen, then immediately stood up. "Just work," he said quickly. But he walked into the hallway before answering. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral. That was the first moment a quiet uneasiness settled somewhere deep in my chest. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was different. And once you notice something different, it becomes difficult to stop noticing. Around the same time, Thomas began mentioning a new colleague from the firm. Her name appeared casually at first. Olivia handled the zoning report. Olivia helped analyze the numbers on that building. Olivia thinks the River North project could double our return. The name appeared so often, it began to sound familiar. One evening, I asked, "Is Olivia new?" Thomas shrugged lightly. "Relatively. She joined the team a few months ago." "Is she good?" He gave a quick smile. "Very." Then he changed the subject. A few weeks later, I met Judith Collins for lunch. My mother-in-law had always maintained a careful politeness toward me, never openly hostile, but never particularly warm either. She had spent years in the real estate business herself before retiring, and she often treated Thomas's company like an extension of her own legacy. We met at a small restaurant she liked near Michigan Avenue. She studied me across the table while stirring her tea. "You look tired," she said. "I've been busy," I replied. "With what?" The question came too quickly. "With the same things I've always done," I said calmly, "helping Thomas manage the properties." Judith smiled faintly. "Oh, Margaret," she said gently. "Thomas's business is much bigger now than it was when you started." I waited. "Successful men eventually need people around them who understand growth," she continued. "Fresh ideas, fresh energy." Her tone was mild, almost thoughtful, but the message sat clearly between us. "Are you referring to someone specific?" I asked. She took a small sip of tea. "I hear very impressive things about one of Thomas's new analysts, Olivia." Judith didn't say the name. She didn't need to. The conversation drifted to other topics after that, but something about the exchange lingered with me long after I left the restaurant. Because Judith Collins had never once expressed concern about Thomas's business before, not until now, not until Olivia. The uneasiness I had been ignoring began to sharpen. Over the following weeks, the changes became harder to dismiss. Thomas started dressing differently. New suits, more expensive watches, cologne I had never smelled before. Once, while hanging his jacket in the closet, I caught a faint scent that definitely wasn't mine. Floral, light, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. I stood there for a long moment with the jacket in my hands, then I hung it up and closed the closet door. Still none of it was proof. And after so many years of marriage, proof was the only thing that mattered. The briefcase continued to travel everywhere with him, but one evening something happened that shifted my curiosity into something sharper. Thomas had come home late after a meeting downtown. He walked directly into his office, placed the briefcase on his desk, and closed the door. A few minutes later, he called from the hallway. "I'm running back out for a minute. Forgot to sign something at the office." I heard the front door close. For several seconds, the house was completely quiet. Then I realized something unusual. Thomas had left the briefcase behind. I stood in the hallway outside his office door, not moving, not breathing, just listening. The room inside was silent. I told myself I wasn't going to open it. Not yet. Curiosity alone wasn't enough reason to violate 26 years of trust, so instead I turned the doorknob slightly and pushed the door open just enough to see the desk. The briefcase sat there closed. The lock was facing me. For a moment I simply stared at it, 4 small rotating number dials. I stepped closer. That was when I noticed something strange. The metal edges around the numbers showed faint wear marks, only on certain digits. As if the same numbers had been used repeatedly, I leaned down slightly studying them. 2, 6, 0, 3. The marks were subtle, but they were there, a pattern hiding in plain sight. For the first time since I had noticed the briefcase, the possibility of opening it no longer felt distant. It felt inevitable. I stepped back from the desk, closed the office door quietly, and walked back into the kitchen. Because I knew one thing with complete certainty now. Sooner or later, I was going to open that briefcase, just not that night. For several days after noticing the worn numbers on the briefcase lock, I did nothing. Life in our house continued exactly as it always had. Thomas left early each morning, returned late most evenings, and spoke about new investments with the same calm confidence he had carried for years. But something had changed inside me. The briefcase was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a question that waited quietly in the background of every conversation we had. I watched Thomas more carefully after that night. Not obviously. After 26 years of marriage, subtle observation comes naturally. I noticed how he positioned the briefcase whenever he set it down, always within arm's reach. I noticed how his fingers instinctively brushed the locks before closing it, almost like someone checking that a door was secure. And once you begin observing something closely, patterns reveal themselves. 2 days later, Thomas left early for a meeting in Naperville. I watched him walk down the driveway through the kitchen window, briefcase swinging slightly at his side. An hour passed. Then 2. By mid-morning, I had almost convinced myself the numbers I'd seen meant nothing, until the front door opened again. Thomas stepped inside, moving quickly. I forgot the appraisal file he called out. I heard his footsteps cross the living room toward his office. A minute later, he emerged again, briefcase in hand. "Found it," he said lightly, kissing my cheek as he passed through the kitchen. "I'll be back late tonight." The door closed behind him. The sound of his car pulling away faded down the street. Only then did I realize something unusual. The briefcase was still sitting on his office desk. Thomas had grabbed a folder, but he had left the case behind. I stood in the hallway staring at the closed office door. The house was completely silent. For a moment, I felt almost embarrassed by the sudden acceleration of my pulse. Then I opened the door. The office smelled faintly of Thomas's cologne and old paper. Sunlight fell across the desk where the briefcase sat exactly where he had left it. I walked toward it slowly. For years, that object had been nothing more than a tool of his work. Now it felt like a locked room inside our marriage. I rested my fingers on the handle. The metal was cool. The 4 small dials stared back at me. 2, 6, 0, 3. My hands hesitated for only a moment. Then I turned the numbers. The lock clicked open with a soft mechanical sound. For several seconds I didn't move. Then I lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of documents arranged with careful precision. Legal filings, property records, contracts. The first folder contained papers stamped with a name I recognized immediately. Collins Urban Holdings, LLC, a new company Thomas had quietly created to hold the properties we once owned together. Thomas's new holding company. At first, nothing about the documents seemed unusual. Many real estate investors placed properties into LLC structures for liability and tax purposes. But as I turned the pages, something strange appeared. 3 addresses, all properties we owned. Each document recorded a transfer of ownership, from Thomas Collins and Margaret Collins to Collins Urban Holdings, LLC. My name appeared on the original property deeds, but it did not appear on the transfer approvals. I flipped through the rest of the folder quickly. Each transfer showed Thomas's signature, and beside it another name, Olivia Grant, not as a witness, not as an analyst, as a co-managing member of the LLC. The room felt suddenly colder. I set the folder down and opened the next one. Inside was a legal document titled Post-Nuptial Property Waiver Agreement. My eyes moved slowly across the text. If signed, the agreement would waive my claim to any properties currently placed under Collins Urban Holdings. The document wasn't dated, but a signature line waited neatly at the bottom. My name printed beneath it. Waiting. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The plan was beginning to take shape. Thomas had already moved the properties. Now he only needed my signature to make the transfer legally secure. I opened the third folder. This one contained financial documents, bank transfers, loan agreements, wire confirmations. One page caught my attention immediately. Personal loan $78,000. Borrower Judith Collins. Purpose residential lease advance payment. Attached to the loan agreement was a copy of a lease contract. The address was in River North, a luxury penthouse apartment. Tenant name Olivia Grant. For a long moment, I simply stared at the page. The pieces slid together quietly. Thomas had created the LLC, transferred the properties, prepared the legal waiver, and arranged housing for the woman who had quietly become his partner in both business and betrayal. This wasn't an impulsive affair. It was a strategy. My fingers rested on the edge of the desk while I absorbed the realization. Then another thought occurred to me. If these property transfers had already been filed, they would appear in public county records. I closed the briefcase carefully and carried the documents into the kitchen. My laptop sat on the counter. Within a few minutes, I had opened the Cook County Property Records website. The search results appeared almost instantly. Each of our buildings was listed. And beside the recent filings, I saw something important. The transfers had been submitted, but they were marked pending review, meaning they were not yet fully finalized. A small detail, but a critical one. My hands rested on the keyboard while I thought. Then I picked up my phone and called the Cook County Clerk's office. After a short wait, a woman answered. Cook County Clerk Property Records Division. Hello, I said calmly. I'm calling about a recent ownership transfer filing. I had a question about the review process. She explained that property transfers involving marital assets often required additional verification, spousal consent, supporting documentation. Without it, the filings could be challenged. When the call ended, I sat quietly in the kitchen for several minutes. The briefcase sat open on the table beside me. The documents lay spread across the surface like pieces of a puzzle that had finally formed a clear picture. For weeks, I had been trying to understand what was happening in my marriage. Now I knew. This wasn't simply a husband drifting toward another woman. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a reckless mistake. Thomas Collins hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been preparing to remove me from the life we had built together, carefully, methodically, piece by piece. And as I looked down at the evidence in front of me, one truth settled quietly into place. I hadn't stumbled into this betrayal by accident. I had been standing inside a plan that had been unfolding around me for months. The kitchen felt unnaturally quiet after I ended the call with the Cook County Clerk's office. The documents from Thomas's briefcase were still spread across the table, each page, revealing another layer of the quiet architecture he had built around our marriage. For years, I had believed our life together rested on shared effort and trust. Now I could see the careful lines of a different structure entirely. I gathered the papers, slowly returning them to the briefcase exactly as I had found them. The folders slid back into place with the same neat precision Thomas had arranged them with. Then I closed the lid. The lock clicked softly. When Thomas returned that night, the briefcase was already sitting on his office desk, exactly where he expected it to be. And I was waiting in the kitchen with dinner on the table. He walked in looking tired but satisfied the way he often did after a long day of negotiations. "How was your day?" he asked casually. "Quiet," I said. It wasn't a lie. Dinner passed in the familiar rhythm we had followed for years. Thomas talked about a potential development deal near the river. I nodded in the right places, asking the occasional question. If he noticed anything different about me, he didn't show it. Later that evening, while he answered emails in his office, I sat in the living room and began searching for a lawyer. I wasn't looking for someone dramatic or aggressive. I needed someone precise. Someone who understood property law as well as divorce. The name Rebecca Lawson appeared several times in the results. Her firm specialized in marital asset disputes involving business holdings. The next morning, I called her office. 2 days later, I sat across from her in a quiet conference room overlooking LaSalle Street. Rebecca Lawson was a woman in her mid-50s with calm eyes and the kind of composure that suggested she had seen every possible variation of betrayal and financial deception. She listened without interrupting as I explained what I had discovered. I handed her copies of the documents from the briefcase, the LLC transfers, the post-nuptial waiver, the loan agreement for Olivia's apartment. Rebecca studied each page carefully. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said quietly, "your husband has certainly been busy." I folded my hands together on the table. "Is it legal?" She shook her head slightly. "Not the way he's done it." Relief didn't come immediately. Instead, I felt something closer to confirmation. Rebecca tapped one of the transfer documents. "These filings move your jointly owned properties into an LLC. That's not unusual by itself. But because the properties were purchased during the marriage, you still have legal interest in them." She slid the page toward me. "And I don't see your consent anywhere." "He was planning to get it," I said, thinking of the unsigned waiver. Rebecca nodded. "Yes, the post-nuptial agreement would have solved that problem for him. But it's not signed." "No," she said calmly, "which means the transfers are vulnerable." She opened another folder. "If you challenge these filings today, there's a strong chance the court would suspend them immediately." For a moment the room felt very still. "So I could stop him now," I said. Rebecca considered me carefully. "You could." Her tone suggested there was more to the answer. But doing it now would also warn him." She folded her hands together. "Once he realizes you know what he's been planning, he'll start protecting himself. Accounts will move. Documents will disappear, and the situation becomes more complicated." The thought settled slowly in my mind. If I acted immediately, Thomas would know the plan had failed. But if he didn't know? Rebecca seemed to read the direction of my thoughts. "How long until the transfers are finalized?" I asked. She glanced at the documents again. "With the county review process, possibly several weeks." "And the birthday party?" Rebecca looked up. "Birthday party Thomas is hosting a reception next month," I said. "Business partners, investors, friends from church." Rebecca's expression shifted slightly. "That sounds public." "It is." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she leaned back in her chair again. "If your goal is simply to stop the transfers," she said, "we can file the challenge tomorrow. But if your goal is to make sure everyone involved understands exactly what he tried to do?" Her sentence trailed off. I thought about the ballroom Thomas had already reserved, the 150 guests he planned to impress, the woman he intended to introduce into the center of his life, and the documents waiting quietly inside his briefcase. "This must feel overwhelming," Rebecca added gently. "You don't have to decide anything today." For the first time since opening the briefcase, I allowed myself a small smile. "I think I already have." Rebecca raised an eyebrow slightly. "What are you thinking?" I hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Right now, Thomas believes I know nothing. That's useful." "Yes." Rebecca tapped her pen against the table. "And the birthday party," I looked out the window at the city streets far below. For weeks, I had believed that party was meant to celebrate Thomas's success. Now I could see it differently. A room filled with witnesses, a stage he had built himself. "I won't file anything yet," I said quietly. Rebecca studied my expression. "You're sure?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "In that case, keep copies of everything. Don't confront him. Let him continue exactly as he has been. That was my plan." I gathered the documents and placed them carefully back into my folder. When I stood to leave, Rebecca walked me to the door. "One more thing," she said before I stepped into the hallway. "Yes, if you decide to move forward with this, it's going to be very public." I thought about Thomas standing at the center of the ballroom smiling beneath the chandeliers. That's exactly the point. Rebecca watched me for a moment longer before nodding. "Then call me when you're ready." Outside the building, the afternoon wind moved through the streets of downtown Chicago. I stood there for a few seconds, letting the air clear my thoughts. For weeks I had believed I was planning a birthday celebration for my husband. Now I understood something much more important. I wasn't organizing a party anymore. I was preparing the ending of my marriage. In the weeks that followed my meeting with Rebecca Lawson, life inside our house continued with almost unsettling normality. Thomas left each morning with the same brisk confidence he had carried for years. He spoke about development projects, investor meetings, and the birthday reception he was planning, as if nothing in the world could possibly disrupt the direction his life was moving. And in a way, he was right. Nothing disrupted it. Not yet. If anything, I helped it move forward. "Have you confirmed the catering numbers?" Thomas asked one evening while flipping through his planner at the kitchen island. "I spoke to the hotel this afternoon," I said calmly. "They'll prepare for 150 guests." He nodded approvingly. "Good. I want the room full. I know." The Drake Hotel ballroom had already been reserved months earlier. What Thomas didn't realize was how carefully I had begun shaping the guest list in the weeks after discovering the contents of his briefcase. The invitations went out exactly as planned. Business partners, investors, developers Thomas hoped to impress. But I added a few names he hadn't specifically mentioned. People who understood property law, people who had financial relationships tied to the buildings he had quietly attempted to transfer. People who paid attention to details. None of those additions raised suspicion. Thomas trusted my ability to organize events. After all, I had spent years quietly managing the logistical side of his professional life. If anything, he seemed relieved that I had taken such interest in planning the party. "You've always been good at this," he said one night while reviewing the seating chart beside me at the dining room table. "It keeps things running smoothly," I replied. Smooth. That word stayed with me. Because the smoother everything appeared on the surface, the less Thomas questioned what was happening beneath it. The briefcase continued traveling everywhere with him. But by then, I had already made copies of every document inside. They were stored carefully in a folder locked inside my desk drawer. Receipts, transfers, loan agreements, everything Thomas believed he had hidden. Rebecca had advised me to gather as much documentation as possible before making any move. Evidence creates clarity, she had said. So clarity was exactly what I built. Quietly, methodically. A few days after my meeting with Rebecca, I called the Cook County Clerk's office again to confirm the status of the property filings, still pending, which meant Thomas was still operating under the assumption that the transfers would eventually be finalized. That assumption worked in my favor. Meanwhile, another development was unfolding that Thomas seemed far less careful about hiding. Olivia Grant began appearing in more conversations, not subtly, not cautiously, just openly enough to signal that something had shifted in his confidence. "She's helping me review the River North numbers tomorrow," he mentioned casually one evening. "That's the apartment building deal?" I asked. "Yes." He didn't look up from his laptop. I studied his face quietly. "She sounds busy." "She is." Another pause. Then he added, "She's very sharp." I nodded. Over the next few weeks, Olivia's presence slowly moved from the background of Thomas's work into the edges of his personal life. He mentioned her opinions during dinner. He quoted her projections during phone calls. Once he even laughed while repeating something she had said about one of his competitors. Each time he watched my reaction carefully, but there was nothing for him to see. I never questioned it, never challenged him, never reacted at all. And the less I reacted, the more comfortable he seemed to become. Comfort breeds carelessness. That truth revealed itself one afternoon when Thomas left his phone on the kitchen counter while taking a call outside. The screen lit up with a message preview. "Olivia. Looking forward to the party. Finally won't have to pretend anymore." The message disappeared before I could read the rest, but I didn't need to. Pretend. The word lingered long after the screen went dark. Later that evening, Thomas mentioned something that confirmed exactly what she meant. "I was thinking Olivia should come to the party," he said casually. "Of course," I replied without hesitation. "She's part of the company." His eyebrows lifted slightly as if he had expected resistance. Instead, I simply continued reviewing the seating chart. "You might even seat her at the main table," I added. Thomas watched me carefully for a moment. That could work. The conversation ended there, but I could see the quiet shift in his confidence. Whatever hesitation he once had about revealing Olivia's place in his life was fading. He believed the future had already been secured, that the property transfers were inevitable, that the waiver he planned to place in front of me would eventually be signed, and that once it was the path ahead, would be clear. Meanwhile, the preparations for the party continued exactly as Thomas envisioned. The hotel confirmed the menu. The florist delivered the arrangements. The guest confirmations steadily climbed toward 150. Every detail moved into place like pieces of a carefully arranged stage. The ballroom, the guests, the speeches, the woman he planned to elevate beside him, and the briefcase containing the evidence he thought only he controlled. One evening, a week before the party, Thomas stood in the living room reviewing the final guest list. "This is going to be a good night," he said, satisfied. "Yes," I replied quietly. He smiled. "For both of us." I looked at the list of names one more time. Investors, lawyers, developers, friends from church, witnesses. Thomas closed the folder and set it on the table. "One more week," he said. I nodded. One more week, because while Thomas believed he was preparing to celebrate the next chapter of his life, I was waiting for the night when everything he had built would finally be revealed, and the evening that would change both of our futures forever was now only days away. The evening of Thomas's birthday arrived with the kind of quiet elegance the Drake Hotel was known for. By the time the first guests began entering the ballroom, the chandeliers were already glowing softly above the long dining tables. White roses and tall glass candles lined the centerpieces, and the staff moved through the room with the practiced grace of people accustomed to expensive celebrations. Everything looked exactly the way Thomas had imagined it. Investors shook hands near the bar. Developers laughed beside the windows overlooking the city. Members of our church greeted one another warmly near the entrance. 150 people filled the room with conversation, expectation, and curiosity. Thomas stood at the center of it all, confident and relaxed, greeting guests, like a man whose success had become undeniable. From a distance, the scene would have looked like a perfect celebration, and for the first 30 minutes it was. Thomas moved easily from table to table, accepting congratulations and handshakes. I greeted guests beside him, smiling politely, introducing people who hadn't met before. No one looking at us would have guessed that anything unusual was about to happen. Then Olivia arrived. She entered the ballroom wearing the same kind of understated elegance she had shown during the months Thomas had spoken about her at home. The black dress, the calm confidence, the faint smile that suggested she already knew she belonged there. Thomas saw her immediately. His face lit up with a brightness that was just slightly different from the expressions he gave everyone else. "Olivia," he said, walking toward her. Several nearby guests turned their attention in the same direction. Thomas placed his hand lightly on her back as he guided her toward the main table. "Everyone," he said, raising his voice just enough for the surrounding conversations to quiet. "This is Olivia Grant. She's been helping our firm with several key projects this year." Polite greetings followed. Olivia nodded graciously, accepting the attention with a composure that suggested she had rehearsed this moment many times before. For a while, the evening continued without interruption. Dinner was served, wine was poured. Laughter filled the space between conversations. But eventually, the moment arrived that Thomas had clearly been waiting for. He stood from his chair at the head table and tapped lightly on his glass. The sound echoed through the ballroom. One by one, the surrounding conversations faded. Thomas smiled at the room the way men do when they know every eye has turned toward them. "I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight," he began. Applause rippled politely across the tables. He continued speaking about the company, about the partnerships that had helped him grow, Colin's property advisors, about the projects still ahead. Then he turned slightly toward Olivia, and of course he said warmly, "Some of the brightest ideas in our firm lately have come from new voices." Several people glanced toward her. Thomas rested his hand lightly on the back of her chair. People who understand where this company is going. The message was subtle, but not subtle enough. Across the room, Laura Simmons exchanged a brief glance with Martha Caldwell. Someone at another table shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Thomas seemed not to notice. Instead, he gestured casually toward the empty chair beside him. "Olivia, why don't you join us up here?" The invitation was quiet, but unmistakable. Olivia stood gracefully and moved toward the head table. At the same moment, Thomas turned slightly in my direction. "Margaret," he said gently, "why don't you sit at the smaller table tonight? We've got a few extra business guests joining us up here." The words were delivered with the same polite calm he had used in the ballroom weeks earlier, but the meaning was identical. The room grew still. For a brief second, the only sound was the soft clink of silverware against plates. Laura's chair shifted slightly across the room. Someone near the back whispered something under their breath, and one of Thomas's investors stared at the tablecloth like he had suddenly forgotten how to look at anyone. I felt the weight of 150 people watching without pretending not to. Humiliation has a very specific silence. I stood slowly. "Of course," I said. My voice was calm. I lifted my glass and walked away from the head table. The smaller table near the edge of the ballroom had been arranged for overflow guests, people who weren't expected to play any important role in the evening. When I sat down, several guests nearby looked uncertain about what to do next. Across the room, Thomas resumed speaking, his voice carried through the microphone again. "To growth," he said confidently. Glasses lifted around the room. But something subtle had shifted. At first it was only a small movement. Laura stood up from her seat. A few heads turned as she walked across the room. For a moment, no one moved. The quiet in the ballroom deepened, the kind of silence that spreads when people realize something important has just shifted, but no one has spoken it out loud yet. Across the room, a waiter froze mid-step, holding a tray of untouched glasses. A couple at the far table exchanged a glance. One of Thomas's investors slowly set his wine glass down. Laura didn't hurry. She simply walked across the carpeted floor with the calm certainty of someone who had already made up her mind. Every step seemed louder than it should have been. When she reached the small table where I sat, she pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down without asking anyone else's permission. A few heads turned. Then Martha Caldwell pushed her chair back. Someone else stood. Another guest followed. Chairs began sliding quietly across the floor one after another as people rose from the larger tables and drifted toward the smaller one near the edge of the ballroom. No announcement was made, no one explained it. But slowly, unmistakably, the direction of the entire room began to change. Instead of returning to the conversation at her table, she walked across the ballroom and sat down beside me. "Mind if I join you?" she asked quietly. "Not at all." A moment later, Martha Caldwell followed, then another guest, and another. Within minutes, the small table Thomas had casually sent me to was no longer empty. Meanwhile, the main table began to lose its quiet certainty. Several of the investors Thomas had been speaking with earlier now watched the room with thoughtful expressions. One of them stood slowly, then he walked across the ballroom and sat down at my table. The movement didn't stop there. Another chair scraped softly across the floor, then another. The quiet migration spread through the room like a change in the direction of wind. People who had arrived expecting to celebrate Thomas Collins were now watching something else unfold entirely. Across the ballroom, Thomas stopped speaking for a moment. His smile flickered. For the first time that evening, he looked around the room, not like a host enjoying a celebration, but like a man trying to understand why the center of gravity had quietly moved somewhere else. And in that moment, Thomas Collins began to realize something he had never expected. The room no longer belonged to him. Thomas cleared his throat and lifted his glass again, trying to gather the room back into the shape he expected. For a moment, the microphone hummed softly in the quiet. Then he smiled, the confident expression he had used in countless negotiations returning to his face. "Well," he said lightly, glancing around the ballroom, "this seems like a good moment for a proper toast." A few scattered chuckles moved through the room. Thomas stepped forward slightly, positioning himself once again at the center of attention. "I've spent most of my life building something I'm proud of," he continued. "Collins Property Advisors started with one small building and a lot of determination. Tonight, looking around this room, I see the people who helped make that possible." Several guests lifted their glasses politely. Thomas spoke about partnership, about vision, about the future of the company. His voice carried easily across the ballroom, practiced and persuasive. Then slowly his attention shifted toward Olivia, and of course, he said, resting his hand on the back of her chair again, "Every successful business eventually needs the right people standing beside it." The sentence hung gently in the air. Everyone understood what he meant. Olivia's smile was composed, almost serene. Thomas raised his glass toward the room. "To the future." Glasses lifted across the tables, but before anyone could drink, another sound entered the quiet, the soft scrape of a chair moving across the floor. I stood. For a moment, Thomas didn't seem to realize what was happening. Then he saw me walking toward the front of the room. The briefcase was in my hand. A few conversations died instantly. Thomas lowered his glass slightly. "Margaret," he said, still smiling, though the expression had grown thinner. "Did you want to say something?" I stopped beside the head table. "Yes," I said calmly. The microphone still stood on the table in front of Thomas. I reached forward and adjusted it slightly. The quiet in the room deepened. "I actually brought a birthday gift for Thomas tonight," I said. A ripple of curiosity moved through the guests. Thomas let out a small laugh. "Well, that's unexpected." I placed the briefcase gently on the table between us. The leather surface reflected the chandelier light overhead. I thought it might be appropriate. I continued to share it with everyone. Thomas's smile faded a fraction. "That won't be necessary," he said lightly. "Oh," I replied, meeting his eyes. "I think it will." I turned the briefcase toward me. The metal locks clicked open. For a brief second, no one in the ballroom seemed to breathe. The faint metallic click echoed louder than it should have in the sudden quiet. A chair scraped somewhere near the back of the room. One of Thomas's investors leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table as if he didn't want to miss what came next. Olivia's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Across the tables, several guests exchanged quick glances, the kind people share when they sense a private moment has just become public. Thomas didn't move. He simply stared at the briefcase, waiting to see what would come out of it. Across the room, someone shifted in their chair. I lifted the lid. The documents inside were arranged exactly as they had been the day I found them. I removed the first folder. "For those of you who work with Thomas," I said calmly, holding up the papers, "you may recognize these." The room remained silent. "These are property transfer filings for 3 buildings currently owned by Thomas and me." A murmur moved through the tables. "They transfer those properties into a company called Collins Urban Holdings, LLC. I glanced briefly at Olivia. "And list a co-managing member many of you may also recognize." Olivia's smile had disappeared completely now. Thomas stepped forward slightly. "That's business paperwork," he said quickly. "Margaret doesn't understand the context." I continued speaking without raising my voice. "The interesting detail," I said, "is that these properties were purchased during our marriage. Several of the investors exchanged looks, and yet," I added, lifting another page, "the transfer approvals do not include my consent." Now the murmurs were louder. Thomas's voice sharpened. "This isn't the time or place for this discussion." I set the papers down calmly. "No," I said softly, "this is exactly the place." From the briefcase, I removed the next document. "This is a post-nuptial property waiver agreement." Gasps and whispers spread through the room. It would have transferred my remaining rights to those buildings once I signed it. Thomas stepped toward me again. "That document was never finalized." "I know," I said. I lifted another folder. "This one is a loan agreement for $78,000. My eyes moved briefly toward Olivia. used to secure a luxury apartment lease in River North. A few guests turned openly toward her now. Olivia sat perfectly still. And the tenant on that lease, I continued calmly, is Olivia Grant. Thomas's face had gone pale. Margaret. Before he could finish, another voice spoke from near the back of the room. Mrs. Collins. A man in a dark suit stepped forward. Victor Ramirez rose from his chair beside me. Several other guests stood with him. Victor removed a folder from his briefcase. As legal counsel representing Mrs. Collins, he said clearly, "We are formally delivering notice that these property transfers are being challenged due to lack of spousal authorization." The words settled heavily over the room. Thomas looked around quickly, realizing several people in the ballroom were now watching him, not as a host, but as a subject of interest. Victor placed the documents on the table beside the open briefcase. "These filings have already been submitted to Cook County for review." The room had become completely silent. Thomas stared at me. "You could have talked to me about this," he said quietly. For a moment, I simply looked back at him. Then I closed the briefcase gently. "We could have," I said. I met his eyes one last time. "We could have 6 months ago. You chose the kitchen instead." The ballroom did not erupt the way dramatic stories sometimes do. There was no shouting, no overturned tables, just silence. The kind of silence that arrives when a room full of intelligent people suddenly realizes they have witnessed something irreversible. Thomas stood frozen beside the open briefcase, his hand still resting on the table where Victor Ramirez had placed the legal documents. Olivia remained seated, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as though refusing to acknowledge the 150 people who had just learned the truth about the apartment in River North. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the whispers began. Quiet conversations moved through the ballroom like wind through tall grass. Investors leaned toward one another. 2 developers near the back of the room quietly gathered their coats. The party was over. Not officially, but everyone could feel it. Within 10 minutes, the room began to thin. Guests left in careful clusters, shaking hands politely, offering short and uncomfortable farewells. Laura squeezed my hand before leaving. "You did exactly what you needed to do," she said softly. Across the room, Victor and Rebecca Lawson were speaking quietly with 2 of Thomas's former business partners. Those conversations ended quickly. The following week revealed just how quickly the consequences would spread. Thomas's first call came 2 days after the party. I was sitting at the kitchen table when his phone rang. He answered in his office, but the raised tone of the conversation carried clearly down the hallway. "This is temporary," Thomas said sharply. A pause. "No, the filings haven't been finalized yet." Another pause. His voice dropped lower. "You're pulling out now." The call ended abruptly. It wasn't the last one. Over the next several days, more calls followed. Investors who had once competed for his attention now spoke cautiously. Development partners suddenly needed time to reconsider the situation. By the end of the week, 2 projects had been quietly suspended. The shift reached beyond business. The following Sunday at church, the usual warmth in the sanctuary felt noticeably cooler. Pastor Andrew Coleman greeted me kindly near the entrance. Thomas arrived a few minutes later. For years, he had been invited to speak during fundraising events and community programs. That morning, no one asked him to say anything at all. Several members of the congregation greeted him politely, but the conversations ended quickly. Reputation once cracked rarely repairs itself overnight. Olivia's situation deteriorated even faster. 3 days after the party, Thomas mentioned casually that she would be taking some time away from the office. The official explanation was vague: professional restructuring, strategic changes. But the reality was obvious to anyone who had been in the ballroom. The firm could not continue employing the woman whose name appeared on documents that had just triggered a legal dispute involving company assets. Within a week, Olivia Grant no longer worked at Collins Property Advisors. Judith Collins reacted in the only way she seemed capable of, with anger. She called the house 2 nights after the party. "You humiliated him," she said immediately. I held the phone calmly. "No," I replied. "Thomas handled that himself. You had no right to expose private business matters like that. They stopped being private when they involved my name on property deeds. Judith's voice tightened. You could have discussed it quietly. We tried quiet, I said gently. Remember the kitchen she hung up soon after? By the following week, Thomas had moved out of the house. Not officially, not permanently, but he had packed a suitcase and taken a few personal items with him. The rest of his belongings remained exactly where they had always been. One evening, several days later, I happened to look through the living room window as a car pulled slowly into the driveway. Thomas sat behind the wheel. The engine remained running. The headlights cast long shadows across the front yard. For a while, he didn't move. Then he reached into the passenger seat and picked up the black leather briefcase. For years, that case had carried the documents he believed would secure his future. Now it held nothing. No contracts, no transfers, no plan left to complete. Thomas sat there in the quiet glow of the dashboard lights, staring at the empty briefcase resting on his lap. And for the first time since the night of the party, it seemed clear that he finally understood something. The future he had been preparing no longer existed. 6 months later, the mornings in my life looked very different. Sunlight moved slowly across the wooden floor of the small kitchen in my new house, touching the edges of the breakfast table where a pot of coffee steamed quietly beside a basket of fresh bread. The house wasn't large, but it was peaceful. The windows looked out over a quiet street lined with old maple trees, and on most mornings I could hear the distant sound of church bells drifting through the neighborhood. I had chosen this place carefully, not because it was impressive, because it was calm. That morning, laughter filled the kitchen. Laura sat at the table flipping through a magazine while Martha poured orange juice into tall glasses. 2 other friends from church leaned against the counter talking easily about weekend plans and grandchildren. Brunch had become something of a tradition over the past few months. Not formal, just coffee, pastries, and the kind of conversation that only happens when people feel completely comfortable with one another. "Margaret, you're spoiling us," Laura said, lifting a warm croissant from the basket. "I've had a lot of practice cooking for groups," I replied with a smile. That part was true, though these days the kitchen felt different, simpler, more honest. I was standing at the stove when Martha suddenly laughed. What I asked. She nodded toward the apron tied around my waist. "You're still wearing it." The apron was plain white cotton, slightly faded from years of washing. For most of my life, it had been nothing more than a practical piece of fabric I wore while cooking dinner or preparing food for gatherings. But sometime after the party, it had taken on a different meaning. Laura smiled gently. "You know," she said, "if someone told me 6 months ago that an apron would become a symbol of survival, I wouldn't have believed them. Neither would I. Yet there it was, hanging on the hook beside the kitchen door every morning, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as proof of something quieter. Resilience. Outside the window, a car rolled slowly down the street. I noticed it only because it paused briefly near the curb across from the house. Through the glass, I could see the driver sitting motionless behind the wheel. Thomas. He hadn't approached the house. He hadn't knocked on the door. For a moment, he simply sat there. Then the car continued down the street and disappeared around the corner. Inside the kitchen, the conversation carried on easily. Laura was describing a trip she planned to take with her sister. Martha had started debating whether the bakery down the street made better pastries than the one near the church. Life had moved forward, quietly, naturally, not with the dramatic finality people sometimes expect from the end of a long marriage, just with steady steps in a different direction. The legal process was still unfolding, but most of the important outcomes had already taken shape. The property transfers Thomas attempted had been blocked. The LLC filings had collapsed under legal scrutiny, and the life he had imagined building with Olivia Grant had dissolved long before any courtroom decision became necessary. I poured another cup of coffee and sat down at the table beside my friends. For a while, we simply talked. About ordinary things, about weather and recipes and the small moments that make up most of a peaceful life. Eventually, Laura reached for another croissant and glanced toward me. "You look lighter these days," she said. I considered that for a moment. Maybe she was right, not because everything had been easy, but because the truth had finally been seen. Sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't anger, it's patience, evidence, and the quiet decision to protect your dignity until the truth reveals itself. If you were in my place, what would you have done when the humiliation happened in that ballroom? Tell me in the comments. I truly want to hear your thoughts. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video. And if you know someone who might need this reminder about patience and self-respect, share it with them. Finally, subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, because sometimes the quietest endings carry the strongest truths. And tonight I just wanted to share mine with you.